Foreign Supplier Verification Program. This is a mandatory requirement. This is not a voluntary one. An importer of certain foods well, actually, the importer of foods is subject to these requirements. It's a mandate. Every importer must now conduct a risk-based evaluation that verifies all of its foreign food suppliers are in compliance with the FDA food safety requirements. This would include verification and documentation that the foreign food supplier is in compliance with HARP-C, right? This hazard analysis, risk-based prevention controls, or standards for produce safety as applicable, right? And the verification must also document that the food is not otherwise adulterated or misbranded because the label fails to disclose food allergens. So the adulteration language is broad adulteration language, and then there's a specific kind of misbranding that the importer must have evidence that is not in play with an imported food. So when Congress says the importer has to verify if the food imports is not adulterated, it's basically placing all food adulteration standards into play here. This is food additive requirements, contamination with bacteria, chemicals, pesticides, filth, decomposition. There are some exemptions we'll talk about in a minute, but this is very, very broad, and it's basically directing FDA to regulate the rest of the manufacturing world through the importer is what this becomes, which is not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be easy. The importer has to establish a record-keeping system and maintain records for 2 years, substantiating compliance with the requirement for each imported shipment. So there's a lot of records involved in this. The importer, this is something significant. Who's the importer here? The importer is defined specifically as, quote, the owner or consignee at the time of entry. So, if there's no U.S. owner or no U.S. consignee, and I presume they mean designated at the time of entry, then the importer would be the foreign manufacturer's U.S. agent or other representative. So basically they're going to say it's the U.S. owner or U.S. consignee, and if there isn't one that can be identified or designated, then the foreign manufacturer's U.S. agent becomes the importer, so that person is responsible for the HARP-C requirements. We started thinking through situations where that might happen, where there's no U.S. owner or U.S. consignee at the time of entry, and I can only really think of northern border or southwest border transactions where the food is declared with a foreign importer of record and a foreign owner, and no discrete consignee. Like maybe that's on a truck and it's going to be stopped off with multiple consignees, and there's no identified consignee. In that case, arguably the U.S. agent would be of the foreign facility would be the importer, and subject to the HARP-C requirements, that's a very significant change. I mean, U.S. agents then would take on that obligation unexpectedly, quite unexpectedly. Failure to comply with this requirement is grounds for FDA to refuse admission to the food. I think it's hard to implement because FDA would actually have to know that the importer is in violation of the HARP-C requirements, and that would require an inspection. Failing to comply is also a prohibited act, like the other provision I was talking about, that makes it a strict liability criminal misdemeanor to fail to comply with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And then, of course, if an importer fails to comply, is also prohibited from importing food at all. So if FDA figures out that an importer is not complying with it, then they can knock that importer out of the market until they comply. So that's the. I also will say this, because the FDA has the power to refuse admission as a remedy, because an importer is not complying, then arguably FDA they probably would do this through an import alert that focuses on importers. Usually import alerts focus on foreign suppliers. I would expect they would use an import alert or some kind of import bulletin that would screen in the FDA systems, the effect of which would be to automatically detain and refuse any food imported by that importer. So it's going to focus on the U.S. Party rather than the foreign party. That's probably how they would do that. Moving along, there are some exemptions I identified. That the first is facilities that are already required to comply with and are in compliance with seafood HACCP or juice HACCP or FDA's low-acid canned food regulations are exempt from being required to provide the information to the importer. This is an exemption that goes to the foreign supplier. The foreign supplier is already subject to these other regs and they're in compliance with them, then the importer does not have to do the verification program. I will say for the last one, low-acid canned food package standards, it's not just packaging, it's also processing, but the low-acid canned food requirements, that's limited to those portions of the control that are related to microbiological contamination. Otherwise, it's everything. The other thing I'll note is that seafood HACCP and juice HACCP only address hazards. They don't address all adulteration issues. So I would suspect that FDA would say that HACCP only covers as much as HACCP covers, and will not cover other adulteration requirements. But we'll see. I know FDA is going to have to interpret that, and I think that would be my argument. My argument would be that Congress said subject to and compliance with HACCP means subject to and in compliance with HACCP, and the FDA can't extend that. But we'll see what they do. FDA has to write regs on this about a year. If FDA doesn't issue regs, it doesn't matter. These provisions become effective anyway. Congress really likes these provisions. They become effective in 2 years after enactment, so that's January 4, 2013. So that's irrespective of whether FDA establishes regs. Obviously, this requirement is designed to result in a worldwide spread of these new HARP-C requirements and standards for produce safety, because that's what they're focusing on, the foreign compliance with these FDA requirements.